Welcome back, everyone, to the Gaza Tribunal. Today is Chamber 2, International Relations and World Order. And it's my pleasure to introduce a panel on the topic of deficiencies of the formal international order. And I'm going to introduce our three speakers right now, and then they'll each speak to you. So the first speaker is Craig Mokhiber, who's an international human rights lawyer and activist. He's a senior UN human rights official and a member of the Gaza Tribunal Steering Committee, and he is co-chair of Chamber 2. Our second speaker will be Phyllis Bennis, who's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. She serves as international advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace, and she's the author of a brand new book, Understanding Palestine and Israel. And our third speaker will be Michelle Burgis-Kasthala, who is a professor of international law at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of the Edinburgh Center of International and Global Law. She's published extensively on international law in the Arab world, and a particular focus on Palestine and Syrian accountability actors. So without further ado, Craig, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lisa. How's the audio? Have we got that fixed? You can hear me all right? I don't hear any acknowledgement, but I don't hear any no's. Well, one correction on that introduction, I am former United Nations. I think that will become clear from my comments. Okay, so I think to understand the international system, we have to not only observe what actors in that system do, but also what they do not do and what they do not say. The fact is, there is a forbidden lexicon at the United Nations, words that officials dare not say. For example, it's simply undeniable that one of the most important forces impacting the international quest for human rights, for peace and security in our world is imperialism. That was so at the founding of the United Nations, and it remains true today. It's a force that affected the design of the organization, privileging power, excluding colonized peoples, ignoring social movements, obstructing sovereign equality, disadvantaging self-determination, and fostering conflict. And it is a force today that stifles the Security Council, that distorts organizational budgets, that corrupts voting in intergovernmental bodies, and that variously directs or constrains secretariat and agency officials. And yet that word is never uttered in the halls of the United Nations. And the same is true of the word colonialism, once not only a common subject of discussion at the UN, but one of its explicit areas of responsibility. But that word all but disappeared at the UN after the wave of decolonization in the 1960s and 70s. The intentional failure to decolonize Palestine, alongside its oppressed siblings in the global South, the subsequent discarding of the cause itself in the political halls of the UN, and the century of suffering of the Palestinian people are all products of the international system's deference to imperial power over its normative obligations. And yet that word is never mentioned either. The third term that's subject to deliberate neglect and an implicit gag order in the UN is apartheid. Unwritten safeguards have long been in place in the Secretariat to prevent UN officials from using the A word. This despite the adoption of a UN Convention on Apartheid with universal application, despite decades of findings of Israeli apartheid by independent UN experts, and despite the findings of the International Court of Justice that the Israeli regime practices apartheid and racial segregation. The organization as a whole still reserves the use of that term for historical discussions on South Africa only. To enforce this, UN reports have been censored, staff have been punished, and public inquiries have been sidestepped by spokespersons on official UN podiums. And then the fourth word that many do not dare speak in the corridors of the UN is genocide. The word genocide, a specific crime defined by the UN Genocide Convention and by the Rome Statute, and the prevention of which is a duty of the UN, is nevertheless only permitted in reference to history. Not for genocides that are happening today, and certainly not for the genocide in Palestine. To enforce this, the UN has adopted a rhetorical trick, a system-wide talking point to insulate itself from pressures to address ongoing genocide. That talking point, echoed virtually every day in the past 19 months by officials across the organization seeking to deflect questions about the genocide in Palestine, goes something like this. Only a court can determine genocide, end quote. Never mind that the same thing can be said about any other crime, but does not seem to prevent officials from speaking about torture or summary executions or collective punishment or other crimes. Never mind that they regularly invoke the word terrorism without the need for a judicial decision, even though it has no agreed international legal definition. Never mind that the organization has obligations of genocide prevention, which is a logical impossibility after the crime has already occurred. This shameful tactic protects officials from having to utter a word that will anger powerful actors like the US, the UK, and Germany. Victims be damned. But words matter, and language can either serve the cause of accountability or that of impunity. If you refuse to even name the disease, you will not find the cure. Of course, these distortions are not new. Indeed, the roots of these problems are as old as the UN itself. 1948 in particular was a watershed in the development of the modern international system. The coincidence of the adoption of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention on the one hand, and the horrors of the Nakba that same year on the other, was just one more historical contradiction. But not only a historical contradiction, it was the birth of a virus, the virus of the Israel exception to international law, that has haunted the organization for decades, carved out space for genocide, and ultimately threatened the very legitimacy and sustainability of the UN itself. As the genocide in Palestine has underscored, unlocking the shackles that have compromised the political corridors of the UN, ending the Israel exception to international law, and moving toward the international law-based functioning of the organization is not only urgent, but it is literally a matter of life or death. Today, Palestine sits directly on the fault line between those who believe that the global order should be determined by great power politics, violence, aggression, war, and imperialism, and those who demand the building of a reliable international system built on international cooperation and the rule of law. The entire edifice of the modern international system, built up since the Second World War, has been constructed on a promise of replacing the anarchic international order that led to the horrors of the first half of the 20th century with a new global dispensation in which international peace and security would be maintained and human rights protected by the rule of law. But that system, as designed, is rife with contradictions and with flaws that undercut its ability to ensure enforcement of the norms and standards upon which it was constructed. Some of its failings are a matter of abdication by officials or other actors, but others are by design. Foremost among these is the tendency hardwired into the system from the start to compromise its mandates and principles in deference to state power, to individual state power, not collective state power. The result for Palestine has been the continuation of a century of colonization, persecution, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide. So what went wrong? Well, long before Israel's assault on Gaza in 2023, the international norms and standards were in place, codified in the UN Charter, in international human rights instruments, and international humanitarian law. The institutions were in place, from intergovernmental bodies and political offices of the UN to the judicial tribunals of the Hague. A UN office entirely dedicated to the prevention of genocide was fully staffed and operating at UN headquarters in New York. A sophisticated, multi-layered UN human rights system was functioning with its headquarters in Geneva and offices across the globe, including in Palestine. And yet the genocide continues to rage, supported by complicit governments and undeterred by international institutions over which the West wields disproportionate power. For their part, the international tribunals have been subjected to an unprecedented and sustained campaign of interference and obstruction, including direct threats from the executive and legislative branches of the US government, public smears from Israel proxy groups, the imposition of state sanctions against court officials, and behind-the-scenes threats and inducements from notorious Israeli spy agencies. So the genocide in Palestine has underscored a fundamental contradiction in the international system. There are, in fact, two UNs. The first is the UN of the Charter norms, constitutionally grounded in a mission of human rights and peace and development and international law. That's the UN of the human rights treaties, of the independent human rights mechanisms, of the International Court of Justice. It's the UN in which the use of force is prohibited in all but a few narrowly defined circumstances. That's the UN of decolonization, the UN in which all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and in which peoples have the right to self-determination. It is the UN in which colonialism, apartheid, gross violations of human rights, and genocide are absolutely prohibited. And it is the UN in which some officials rang the genocide alarm bell as far back as October of 2023. The UN in which special rapporteurs stood up to the slings and arrows of abusive Western governments and Israel proxy groups to speak truth to power and to challenge the Israeli regime and its collaborators with law and facts and uncompromising principle. But there is another UN, a UN that permitted the colonization of Palestine, partitioned the land against the will of the indigenous people, ratified the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by recognizing Israel in 1948, and tolerated decades of apartheid. It is the UN that suspended the application of international law for 3 decades in favor of a disingenuous political process called Oslo, under which the UN for 3 decades told Palestinians they must negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that the mediator for that process would be the world's sole superpower, which also happened to be Israel's closest ally and arms supplier. And it is the UN that has remained almost entirely silent as genocide raged across the land, trepidatiously avoiding any reference to the crime of genocide or to its root causes. The UN that was unable to order a ceasefire or to hold to account perpetrators openly committing genocide. As the genocide in Palestine has shown, the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the only UN body with formal enforcement power, is the most obvious example of failure by design. The power has been used throughout the genocide by the US as Israel's chief ally and co-perpetrator of the genocide to prevent any meaningful act of protection for Palestinian civilians, enforcement of international law, or accountability for Israeli perpetrators. 5 successive vetoes have been exercised by the United States since October of 2023, bringing US vetoes to protect Israeli impunity to a total of 49. After each veto, thousands more Palestinians were killed in the ongoing genocide. No sanctions have been imposed by the Council on the perpetrator regime. No military intervention has been mandated. No protection force mobilized. No judicial decisions enforced. And the Israeli regime even remains a full member of the United Nations with full privileges, despite its perpetration of genocide, its serial acts of aggression against a number of UN member states, and frequent attacks on the United Nations itself, its staff, and its facilities. What then can the UN, its member states, and all who support its founding principles do to end a genocide, protect its victims, and hold its perpetrators to account when a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council is itself implicated in the perpetration of the genocide and fully committed to its continuation? Do the jus cogens and erga omnes norms of international law, such as the prohibition of genocide and apartheid and the right to self-determination, simply disappear in the face of a US veto? Or are states and international organizations able and indeed obliged to take other meaningful action? The answer, from both a moral and a legal perspective, is that they can and they must. And this, in part, is where the General Assembly comes in. For its part, the General Assembly has convened an emergency special session under the extraordinary procedures of the Uniting for Peace resolution. It has adopted important resolutions to respond to the genocide in the face of a captured and moribund Security Council. And the Assembly has declared that all countries are obliged to comply with the detailed findings of the International Court of Justice. In the wake of successive failures by the Security Council to act, the General Assembly has adopted resolutions for an immediate ceasefire. And most significantly, it has adopted a resolution in September of 2024, endorsing in its entirety the findings of the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of July 2024, declaring the Israeli occupation to be entirely unlawful, demanding its immediate end, an end to the settlements, to the wall, and to the apartheid system. that Palestinians must be allowed to return home and be compensated, that Palestinians do not have to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that all states are obliged to cease all military, diplomatic, economic, commercial, financial, investment, trade, political, and legal relations with the Israeli occupation. It declared as well that the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice on the Israeli genocide in Palestine must be implemented. These actions by the General Assembly were historic, and they were adopted with overwhelming majorities demonstrating a commitment of most of the world to Palestinian freedom and Israeli accountability. But even as the horror drags on and Israel shatters record after record for civilian bloodletting, the UNGA has yet to use the full range of powers at its disposal. The General Assembly continues to recognize Israel's credentials, and the regime's voting rights remain intact, even as it attacks and smears the organization, blocks its operations, raids and demolishes its installations, and abducts, detains, tortures, and murders UN staff. The UNGA has yet to reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms, has established no tribunal or other mechanism for accountability. It has not moved under Uniting for Peace to mandate a protection force, and it has not followed up its important September 2024 resolution in order to solidify the call for sanctions and other urgent measures to isolate the Israeli regime and hold its officials to account. Elsewhere, Switzerland, acting as depositary for the Fourth Geneva Convention, ultimately declined to convene the Conference of High Contracting Parties, despite the fact that it was requested by an overwhelming number of UN member states. It cited an absence of consensus on a draft declaration that it had prepared as the basis for its inaction, an excuse that could hardly hold water, given that such conferences had previously been convened without such consensus. Indeed, the last such conference in 2014 was entirely rejected by Israel, the United States, and Canada, all of which even boycotted the conference itself. And yet the 2014 conference was convened, and it adopted an important outcome document. In 2025, by contrast, Switzerland effectively granted a veto to Israel and its complicit allies, raising questions about the very idea of Swiss neutrality. In the end, the decision of Switzerland as depositary not to convene the Conference of High Contracting Parties was widely seen as the latest failure of long-established international institutions to respond fairly and effectively to the genocide in Palestine. But beyond these intergovernmental bodies, the tendency to compromise UN principles in deference to power, especially the power of the US and its Western allies, has also been evident in the positioning of the UN Secretary General, his senior staff, and agency heads across the system, where the Israel exception has been in plain view. Throughout the perpetration of the genocide, the UN's senior-most political leadership, including the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, have remained unable or unwilling to directly address the genocide or even to utter the word, instead taking refuge behind the safe language of armed conflict, the amorphous promise of a two-state solution someday, and the necessity of humanitarian aid. Worse, they've adopted a kind of both-sidesism, which fails to recognize the true dynamics of colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, genocidaire and victims. And barely a whisper has been heard about accountability for Israeli perpetrators. As such, the significant reserve of moral and political power in the senior-most podiums of the organization has been left largely untapped. As a result, root causes, normally the first area of inquiry in conflict resolution, have been almost entirely ignored in successive diplomatic processes and political interventions on Palestine. They are left instead for consideration only by the human rights mechanisms, but they find no place in political processes. The seizure of Palestine in 1948, the colonization of Palestine, the theft of land and homes within the Green Line, the ethno-nationalist state, the system of apartheid, the systematic gross inequalities, official racism and dehumanization, and the plight of generations of Palestinian refugees, colonial domination, none of these have received any significant attention in the statements of the political leadership or in the succession of failed political processes launched first in Oslo during the 1990s. This despite the fact that it is by now recognized as axiomatic that sustainable conflict resolution cannot succeed without attention to root causes. Perhaps worse, the political offices operating under the direct authority of the Secretary General, including those responsible for political affairs, for the prevention of genocide, for sexual violence and armed conflict, and for children in armed conflict, have not only largely ignored the genocide in Palestine, but in some cases, under external, mostly Western political pressure, and without exercising the most basic level of due diligence, have sometimes non-critically endorsed or disseminated the Israeli regime's fabricated propaganda for genocide and its justifications for international crimes. For months, as the genocide raged, and as human rights monitors, UN officials, independent UN human rights mechanisms, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation in occupied Palestine, as well as genocide scholars around the globe, rang the genocide alarm bell, the Office of the Secretary General's Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide remained entirely silent on the carnage in Gaza. When she finally and belatedly issued a statement after a global wave of criticism for her silence, after calls from within the UN for her resignation, and a determination by the International Court of Justice that charges of genocide against Israel were indeed plausible, she managed only a weak, equivocal statement that, quote, echoed equally weak statement already made by the Secretary General. She took note of the order of the ICJ, and on balance expressed more concern for the perpetrator state than for the victims of genocide in Palestine. The Secretary General's Special Advisor on Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict, under an organized pressure campaign from the Israeli regime and its proxy organizations in the West, parroted Israel's fabricated accusations of a mass campaign of rape by Hamas, and then in doing so contributed to the regime's false narratives that were designed purposefully to manufacture consent for genocide in the West. And the Office of the Special Advisor on Children in Armed Conflict, under political pressure from and through the Secretary General, repeatedly censored its own annual listing of countries, systematically violating the rights of children in situations of armed conflict, to remove Israel and ensure its continued impunity. Only in 2024, in the context of the murder of thousands of Palestinian children by Israeli forces and sustained pressure from civil society, the Special Advisor was finally compelled to include Israeli forces in its annual listing of violators to the Security Council. We should not be surprised by these failures. Indeed, these offices were designed to be politically controlled so as not to offend key political constituencies. They are not human rights mechanisms. They are political mechanisms. Well, I've painted a dark scenario on the international stage, but as I conclude, let me finish with 3 points of light. First, the principled role of independent UN human rights mechanisms. In sharp contrast to the historic failings of the political offices reporting to the Secretary General in New York, the independent human rights mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council in Geneva have maintained a principled law-based approach to their human rights monitoring and reporting duties, despite massive pressure from Israel and its Western allies and ongoing harassment from Israel proxy groups. These independent special procedures have exhaustively documented Israel's crimes, affirmed its culpability for genocide, and helped to maintain public attention to the genocide in Palestine. An especially important role has been played by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. In the face of a sustained campaign of harassment and smears by the government of Israel, its allies and proxies, Rapporteur Francesca Albanese has been undeterred, producing a series of meticulously documented analytical reports on the genocide and its colonial roots, maintaining a continuous visible media presence and close collaboration with Palestinians and global civil society. Several other independent mandate holders have also worked diligently, both individually and collectively, to defend the human rights of the people of Palestine and to build the case for Israeli accountability, despite efforts to discredit or silence them. Notice that throughout the genocide, the contrast between the principled, fact-based, law-centered, and accountability-focused approach of the independent special procedures on the one hand, and the equivocal, politicized, and trepidatious rhetoric of the Secretariat on the other could not be starker. Secondly, there is the International Court of Justice. The ICJ is also a part of the UN system. Thanks to the court, the Israeli regime is today on trial for genocide. The court has issued several rounds of provisional measures. It has found the regime is guilty of apartheid and racial segregation, and has held that its occupation of Palestinian territory is entirely unlawful and must end quickly and entirely. These pronouncements provide even more proof of the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause and the illegitimacy of Israel's project and crimes in Palestine. Finally, the UN also includes courageous humanitarian workers from a host of agencies, foremost among them the people of UNRWA, who to this day continue to operate in the depths of Gaza's hell to support the survivors of the genocide. Despite the smears of the Israeli regime and its collaborators in Washington and Europe, despite the bombs, the bullets, the widespread destruction, the targeting of UN facilities, the abduction and torture of countless UNRWA staff, and the murder of more than 310 of them, many along with their families. They too are the United Nations. They represent the best of the UN system, and they embody its highest principles, and they deserve our unwavering solidarity. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to the organizers for pulling us all together over these days. Everything that Craig has just said about the weaknesses of the accountability institutions of the United Nations is absolutely true. Everything he said. And it's primarily the lack of direct institutional enforcement that brings that weakness. There's a famous saying that came from a US military leader that said, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" when someone was discussing moral leadership, and the answer was, well, yeah, that's not where it comes from. You could also say that about the International Court of Justice. They not only don't have troops, they don't even have a police force, they don't even have a process server that is in a position to drop off their papers around the world. So I agree with everything that Craig said about the limitations. And what I think is very important is that this is not only a system with deficiencies. There is a critical question of redefining what enforcement looks like. And I would assert that enforcement lies with us, with civil society. The United Nations, as we know, was not established to represent people, despite the soaring words of the charter, we the peoples. It's really about we the governments. And in that context, the most powerful governments exert the most power throughout the institution. So what happens with something like the decisions of the International Court of Justice, which has been in an extraordinary role over these last couple of years? South Africa violated all of the earlier understandings about what the International Court of Justice was all about. It was designed to be a court for the powerful, a court for the white colonial countries. And here was South Africa, an African country, having recently overthrown its own system of apartheid, to say, no, that's not how the world works, not anymore. This is the post-colonial world, and we are taking this institution into our own hands to say we are going to hold accountable the most important ally in the region of the most important and most powerful, most influential country in the world in terms of economic, military, and most other forms of direct power. So the question then becomes, well, how does that decision get implemented? For the International Court of Justice, which is, of course, the World Court, the court of the United Nations, it was delegated out to the United Nations agencies. It said explicitly, the Security Council, and most of all, it said, the General Assembly, are now responsible for making real these decisions made by the International Court itself. Then it goes to individual governments. And my position is that ultimately the power to make that change, to implement the decisions, lies with us, with civil society and social movements around the country. And we have an example to look at. So we know this works. Throughout the 1980s, in the era of South African apartheid, you had a situation where, similarly to now, the Security Council was controlled by the US veto, occasionally the Brits, but mainly it was the United States. In a period from 1970 until now, 1/3 of all US vetoes were cast to prevent the United Nations from condemning or imposing sanctions on South African apartheid. So the Security Council was essentially paralyzed. The work turned to the General Assembly, and resolution after resolution after resolution was passed calling for sanctions, for banking sanctions, corporate sanctions, sports sanctions, one of the most important in terms of influencing the majority of white voters and white people in South Africa, those who were allowed to vote. So the problem then became, well, General Assembly resolutions are not legally enforceable, unlike those of the Security Council or, ironically, the International Court of Justice. Those are considered binding resolutions, but there's no structure to enforce them. So what we had was a situation where anti-apartheid movements grew all around the world, taking up the demand to impose sanctions, to isolate, to stop banking with South Africa, to stop corporate relations with South Africa, to stop importing South African goods, trade embargoes, arms embargoes, all happened not because governments necessarily wanted to do so, but because their capitals were flooded by anti-apartheid protesters, also true in the United States, who were demanding that their own governments use these resolutions of the General Assembly as a menu, if you will, as a list of all the things that needed to be done. And they pressed their own governments hard enough that one government after another, after another, after another, began to impose sanctions, stopped dealing with apartheid South Africa, fought back against US pressures to continue those relationships. So eventually, enough countries, including those that were close allies of the United States, had taken up the issue of sanctions against South Africa, that the United States government itself, after long years of pressure, led at that time by the Black Caucus of the US Congress, was forced to agree, was forced to give in, allow the Congress to pass laws demanding sanctions against South Africa. President Reagan at the time vetoed the decisions of the Congress, but there were enough votes in the Congress to override the veto, and eventually the United States itself was willing to impose sanctions. Now, that wasn't willing by the government, it was forced on the government by the pressure of a powerful social movement. What we now face with Israeli apartheid and now Israeli genocide is a very similar situation where the International Court of Justice has issued its preliminary opinions about the plausibility of Israeli actions constituting genocide, has called essentially for an absolute end to Israeli actions by saying that in its provisional measures, even before a final determination of genocide, because the Genocide Convention, like the Apartheid Convention, calls for not only the stopping of genocide, but the prevention of genocide. The International Court has said explicitly that all of the signatories to that treaty, which is the vast majority of countries in the world, of course, including Israel itself, but more importantly, including virtually all of Europe, the United States, all of the powerful countries that have been backing the Israeli genocide, calling on them to act to prevent a genocide from occurring, and if it happens, to stop it. That means the obligations of international law are now looming over every one of these governments. So we're not even talking here about sanctions. We're talking about implementing the requirements of international law. And if that is refused, we are then talking about rogue states, outlaw states, pariah states that are deliberately, publicly refusing to implement an order an enforceable order of the International Court of Justice and the overwhelmingly majority opinion of the General Assembly of the United Nations. So in that context, where the General Assembly, of course, has no veto, it called for, as Craig described so brilliantly, in a resolution last September of 2024, all of what the International Court of Justice had called for and added more. It called for massive restrictions on arms sales. That would have meant, because the language was a very low bar, it said that there must be no provision or transfer of arms or related equipment where there is, quote, reasonable grounds to suspect that they may be used in the occupied Palestinian territory. That they only have to suspect that they could be used, which is anything, because we know Israel is now using everything in its arsenal short of nuclear weapons so far against the people of Gaza. In that context, arms cannot legally be provided to Israel. So my government, the government of the United States, is violating international law on a daily basis with its provision of arms, as are Germany and to a much smaller degree, Italy. So if we follow that South Africa model, we know it works. At that time, like now, it was led by governments of the Global South who responded more quickly to social pressures. But in this context, we have a tool to stop the banking relations, stop the corporate relations, stop trading, stop arming, stop engaging with another apartheid regime 50 years later. So in that context, when Israel has been ordered itself to prevent the actions that it is carrying out from becoming genocidal, and specifically to prevent its military from committing any of the acts enumerated in the Convention Against Genocide, killing members of the group, seriously injuring members of the group, creating conditions that prevent the existence of the group to survive. All of these are now direct violations of the court's legal judgment. And that means that every action of every Israeli soldier, whether they are commanding or carrying out illegal orders, stand in violation of international law, and under the theory of universal jurisdiction, should be vulnerable to arrest and trial anywhere in the world. The court decision and the resolution of the General Assembly remind states of their obligations to abide by the Genocide Convention, like the Apartheid Convention, including that notion of preventing and punishing both. There's a list of ICJ requirements. As I said, it's like a menu to provide governments with all the things that they need to be doing to be in accordance with international law and not stand in violation, to withdraw military forces, to stop importing settlement goods, ceasing the provision or transfer of arms and munitions and related equipment. That means that transition of weapons across airspace, across waters, is also illegal. So enforcement needs to be redefined. We know that the system of the United Nations was not designed to enforce the rules of the UN itself on governments. Quite the contrary. Governments are supposed to be able to go their own way. But the General Assembly, which represents by far the most democratic component of the United Nations, is the least able to impose legal requirements, except in the most extraordinary circumstances, which it is now using under the Uniting for Peace precedent of 1951. Real enforcement, as we know, is not going to come by volunteers among those governments. It's going to come from governments who are pressured by their own people, demanding through organized movements, the global anti-apartheid movement, the global movement now against genocide. That is what is going to create the power to force governments to abide by international law. We know it works. It worked 50 years ago. under enormous pressure. 50 years ago, remember, it was the center of the Cold War. The opposition to apartheid in South Africa was cast as supporting communism in the West. It was cast as supporting terrorism. You all know that President Nelson Mandela remained on the United States Don't Let Him In terror and terrorism list until 2008, when he was no longer the president. He had already been released from Robben Island prison. He had been elected the first elected president in South Africa and was still on the US terrorism list. Given that, the ability of that movement to force a change in the United States at the height of the Cold War was extraordinary. We know it works. It can be done again. Because it's not really now even sanctions, it is not that kind of voluntary choice of governments. This is the requirement of international law. So now we know what our government is going to have to do. The United States, I'm afraid, is going to still be the last, as it has been before, dragged kicking and screaming reluctantly into abiding by international law that is binding by the rest of the world. All of these efforts to say, this isn't about international law, this is about the international system, an international rules-based order. Well, who determines that rules-based order? That rule that forms the rules-based order doesn't exist. What does exist is international law. You can violate it, you can abide by it, but it exists. You know what it says. And that's our job now as movements, is to force our governments by dint of nonviolent pressure in the streets, in the suites, in economic pressure, in boycotts, divestment, sanctions against our own governments that are refusing to abide by international law. We know it works. This is how our movements, taking on the lessons of half a century ago, will make the change to end the genocide, to end the apartheid, to create the conditions for Palestinians to win their own battle against those horrific phenomena, as did the people of South Africa 50 years ago. Thank you.
Phyllis?
I suppose I'm going next. Yeah, sorry. Should I just go straight ahead?
Yes, I was just going to say, our third and final speaker is Michelle Burgis-Kasthala. Sorry, go ahead.
We're running way behind, so feel free to stop me at some point. So my brief really then is to talk about, to come back to courts. And I think my talk really builds very well on both Craig and Phyllis's wonderful contributions. And I'm going to think broadly about, obviously, the International Court of Justice, but also the ICC, and really try to make the point that international courts, by definition, are shaped by states, are reliant on states, are the product of states. And so whatever we do with them, we have to be cognizant of those limitations, but that also there are still ways in which we can work productively, creatively with them. So I'm going to sort of give you a bit of an overview of the possibilities there. But because Palestine itself has struggled for so long around this question of statehood, I think that really has shown us how limiting its engagement has been up until relatively recently, that I think that perhaps then in sort of stressing the point of statehood at this moment, even in the midst of genocide, is a new way in which I think to sort of recenter some efforts. So firstly, I think, we've definitely heard that the ICJ in the past was very much a product of the UN system, which itself is highly imperial in many ways in nature. And the ICJ, particularly around the problem of apartheid that Phyllis has told us about, had been absolutely sort of almost destroyed in terms of its legitimacy in the 1960s up until 1971 over this very question of its role in potentially trying to stop or to continue the apartheid regime in Southwest Africa. And so it's quite interesting that we're now at this moment again where the ICJ is becoming this sort of central site in which to think about legitimacy for an apartheid and now a genocide struggle. I think what's really important is that after that debacle of the 60s or the 50s and the 60s, the ICJ did in many ways, this is a sort of standard narrative in literature, the ICJ righted itself, particularly through the Nicaragua case of 1986. And if you look at the docket since, it's absolutely skyrocketed. There have been so many new global South states that have brought various issues to the court, not necessarily relating to the big issues like genocide, but even just sort of basic issues, particularly in relation to things like boundary disputes. So the court really, I think, is well established now, not simply as a site for the global north, but very much, maybe even more so, as a site for the global south, but only if you're a state. This is the big problem for Palestine. And so really, until 2012, Palestine could not directly participate in any meaningful way before the court, because in terms of the contentious jurisdiction of the court, we need it to be based on state consent. And until 2012, when Palestine became a non-member observer state at the UN General Assembly, those steps really couldn't be taken. Now, the problem with Palestine's formal membership of the UN up until today is the fact that we need both Security Council and General Assembly agreement, essentially, and this is constantly blocked by the US veto. We've already heard from Craig about the problems of the US veto. This we saw most recently in April 2024, when there were renewed efforts to try to get full UN membership for Palestine. We have to remember as well that because of the court's reliance on state consent, it's extremely deferential to states. It can't, as we've heard from Phyllis, actually implement, through its own police force, it can't actually ensure that its decisions are implemented. It has to rely on states, either themselves or most acutely through the Security Council. And so particularly for Palestine, this presents quite a problem. So in the past then, really, issues relating to Palestine before the court have been incidental, have been ancillary. These cases, firstly, though, began a century ago. It's important to remember that from the very inception, not simply of the ICJ, but of the Permanent Court of International Justice, questions around the conduct of Britain in its mandate at the time came under scrutiny. Okay, in an ancillary fashion, in an oblique fashion, but through the Mavromatis dispute. Questions later around Palestine arose as well before the ICJ in relation to the headquarters agreement. So we did have some, little sort of murmurings about possibilities of how to use the court, but these are obviously not very significant. I think what we need to focus our efforts on, and Phyllis has brought this out though, is the potential of advisory jurisdiction powers of the court. And so, we've now got 2 decades of practice here. If we turn our minds back, for example, to the Wall advisory opinion, it's sort of scary that that's now, unfortunately, 2 decades ago. But this was a really significant decision at the time. And we now have had, as we've heard from our speakers as well, the July 2024 advisory opinion, and now the pending advisory opinion in relation to Israel's ban on UNRWA. Now, as we've heard, advisory opinions are not technically binding. They are not a contentious case as we have between 2 states, South Africa, Israel. But what we should see them as is simply an iteration of a statement, of a very persuasive statement on the binding commitments of all states, especially through notions of customary international law. Even if a state hasn't signed a treaty, much of the time, these norms are binding on states. And so I think we should see them as authoritative statements that need then to be taken up by actors, particularly, for example, as Phyllis said, in relation to civil society actors. But for our purposes as well, even if they're not binding, at the end of advisory opinions, we always get this list of demands that the court makes, and we saw that in 2004, where the court, for example, called on Israel to dismantle the wall, to provide compensation to for the destruction that had resulted, and it also called on third states to take a number of actions. And because Israel has failed to respect that advisory opinion, we've now got 21 years of a failure to respect that advisory opinion. I think this is excellent material in which we can try to establish a pattern of impunity. And for me, this pattern of impunity is fundamental in making a case, in particular for calling for Israel's suspension or expulsion from the UN. Because particularly if you have the example of a UN member state failing to comply for over 2 decades with the principal judicial organ of the UN, this, I think, is a case to make. And then we also have to take the struggle domestically, as Phyllis has laid out, with our own respective governments. Much more important, though, really, for our purposes here, I think, is the July 2024 advisory opinion. Advisory opinions are always basically responses to questions that are brought to the court, usually by the General Assembly, sometimes by the Security Council. And the questions put to the court there were essentially partly around specific violations taking place across the OPT, but also with these practices combined, the general question being, how do these policies and practices of Israel, referred to above in the first question, affect the legal status of the occupation? And what are the legal consequences that arise for all states and the UN from this status? And this is crucial because, as Nimra was talking about yesterday, so much of the time, I think huge amounts of energy have been focused on listing, detailing ad nauseum specific violations of Israel and the OPT. This work is important, but this work doesn't ask the big question of what's happening per se here. And so finally, I think the court could actually grapple with that. Now, of course, the court was only thinking about the 67 reality. It wasn't thinking about the situation since 1948 and the Nakba. So we can critique this advisory opinion in and of itself for still being far too restrictive and constrained in its scope. But for what it was doing, it was still very significant, I would say. And so this is what we have to work with to think about these broader questions. Okay. And so the court handed down a really detailed and well-reasoned opinion. And it went through all of these systematic violations. It basically largely overwhelmingly agreed with all of the contentions brought around these violations, but crucially, it held that there was a breach by Israel of 2 peremptory norms. The right to self-determination for the Palestinian people, and secondly, the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force. Under customary international law, forget about treaties, these are peremptory norms and they are binding on all states. No derogation is possible for Israel or for third states, okay? And so this then meant that there could be no tweaking here of the occupation. The occupation wholly was illegal. It was very black and white here. The only possibility of stopping this illegality then is for Israel to withdraw in toto, entirely. It also then was called on to evacuate all of the settlements and to provide reparation. And we heard from one of our speakers earlier on that there have been many efforts to already document the sheer scale of damage that has been caused over the years by the occupation. So, this work needs to continue if we can try to honour this call for reparation in the future. And it also then, the court made a number of findings in relation to what is required of third states, particularly in relation to not recognising the status, Israel's status as legal in the territories, not to render aid or assistance, but actually to go further and to try to take steps to end it as soon as possible. So I think this has been really central, this decision, particularly in terms of informing, as we've heard from Craig, the special the General Assembly resolution in September. Now that resolution, for my purposes in thinking about statehood, is really important because firstly it said that Israel has to withdraw by this September. So it gave Israel a year to withdraw from the occupied territories. So we're talking 4 months from now. We need to use that as actually a clear pressure point. And secondly, it called for a conference to be held on the 2-state solution as one sort of possible response to this advisory opinion. That conference is going ahead next month at the UN. Now, of course, we can all critique the 2-state solution, of course, but if we try to use it at least as ammunition to think through the possibilities from this advisory opinion, I think it's important. Now, for our focus on Gaza and the genocide, this decision is also very important because the court, even though it said, we're not going to talk about what's happening over there, it did say that it still presumes the situation of Gaza is one of occupation. And what that entails then is that Israel has positive obligations in terms of the welfare of the population while it is the occupying power. And I would say then that once we've had an amplification of the denial of the welfare of the population, which we've seen particularly since the siege, since the blocking of humanitarian aid, that I would say that's an aggravated breach of this requirement upon Israel as the occupying power to look after the population. And so then in some ways, then this is a further breach to the requirement, to that obligation from the court itself, okay? But obviously we know that in fact, instead of honouring that requirement of welfare for the population, Israel has actually done the very opposite. Instead of providing life-sustaining provisions and infrastructure, it has produced its very opposite, which is genocide. And we've seen then that the court has also been engaged directly in relation to the question of genocide. We've had that explained a little bit by our speakers, so I'll try to sort of skim over it. I mean, one aspect I find really interesting that, I mean, it's not substantively maybe massive, but this is something that I think we could push for as well if we're thinking about future efforts on our own states, is that there is a mechanism within the ICJ statute to allow for intervening states to participate in contentious, bilateral state-to-state disputes. And thus far, we have 13 states that have intervened in the South Africa-Israel case: Belize, Cuba, Palestine, Ireland, Bolivia, the Maldives, Chile, Turkey, Spain, Mexico, Colombia, Libya, and Nicaragua. This is one of the largest examples ever of states intervening. I think it shows the enormity of the case, and I think that could be one pressure point in which at least some civil society activity could be taken. So we know that the ICJ has so far issued 3 provisional measures orders. These are binding, and I think what our focus should be with these provisional measures orders, because in some ways they're unfortunately quite dated. It's just devastating to think about the fact that there was a moment before Rafah was totally flattened. But I think, again, what they underscore is not simply the breach of these orders, but their aggravated breach. The fact that, Israel was called upon not to carry out its operation in Rafah, that it has been called on to continue its obligations as an occupying power to provide for the welfare of the population. It has then instead gone about and, for example, banned the activity of UNRWA. These are all further examples of the way, not only, it's not a neutral account here, it's actually further going against these fundamental requirements placed upon it by the court. So I see these as all pressure points. I had wanted to talk about the ICC. I don't want to sort of take up too much time. I would say that the ICC story, as I have tried to set out with the ICJ story, is one very similar because of the problem of statehood. Palestine first tried to become a member of the ICC in 2009. It only actually became a member, though, in 2015, after all of this stuff happened at the General Assembly through Palestine's non-member observer state status. But even then, it took 6 years more for the ICC to confirm that it would actually act on Palestine's accession, when in the pretrial chamber decision of 2021, it confirmed that at least for the purposes of its jurisdiction, it was happy to take up investigations in relation to possible offences carried out by Palestinians or those on the territory of Palestine, understood as the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. So this 2021 decision was absolutely crucial then, because it meant that once we got, unfortunately, to October 2023, we could say straight away, no, the court has very clearly said it's happy to exercise its jurisdiction. There's no dispute now about Palestinian statehood in terms of the court actually launching an investigation. But yet again, further paralysis. It took so much time to get those arrest warrants that we finally saw basically a year later. I think for our purposes, what we need to think about in terms of how to use the ICC would be, we really need to think about how to sort of lobby for expanding the list of charges that are currently against both Gallant and Netanyahu, potentially to think around crimes such as genocide. We also need to think about other officials, civilian and military, being charged by the ICC itself. But I think far more importantly, we need to see the ICC as part of this cascade of domestic law options, of civil society options, because we are in a moment now where very clearly we have statements of Israeli criminality from the ICC or alleged criminality, the possibility of it, as well as Israeli illegality on the part of the ICJ with its finding of Israel's illegal presence. And so we need to sort of capitalize on all of this to then, I think, really bring about further activity, potentially, for example, as I've tried to hint at, through pushing for Israel's suspension or expulsion from the UN under Article 6 of the Charter. We also need to think, I suppose, whether to just give up on something like the two-state solution for the conference being held next month, or whether we can think creatively, because I think what I've really tried to show is that when it comes to international courts, the most important aspect is always, unfortunately, statehood. And so it's about how to try to exploit that creatively to stop the genocide and to realize Palestinian self-determination. And then finally, as well, to push for reparations would be the goal. Thanks very much.
I thank all three of you for a really stimulating and intensely informative panel. And we are going to say thank you and goodbye. Craig Mokhiber has completed his quota of performances. Phyllis will return in a subsequent panel today, and Michelle will stay on. So I'm turning over the panel now to the next moderator, Penny Green. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all. Craig, I hope you're still there, because I wasn't sure if you were going to be summing up the chamber at the end of the afternoon. I mean, that's a big ask, given the time that you've been awake today.
I know that we had put aside some time for some kind of a discussion at the end. I'm more than happy to help with that if we're on course enough to actually retain that space.
A brilliant panel. We are now moving to a sort of a fairly short panel, but looking at conceptions of alternative jurisprudential paradigms, or alternative paradigms for looking at some of the world's major problems like genocide, problems like occupation. And we're extremely fortunate today to have representatives from the Permanent People's Tribunal based in Rome, or perhaps in Milan. And we are also going to have Michelle back. Thank you, Michelle, doing double service today. And I'm going to start with Michelle, and Michelle's going to talk about People's Tribunals as alternative justice sites, assessing the role of civil society. And then I'll come back to Helen Jarvis and Gianni. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Penny. Back with the Australian accents. Sorry for another presentation straight afterwards. So I'm, as an international lawyer, obviously, you know, I tend to focus on courts, as I just talked about, but increasingly I've been quite captivated by people's tribunals as alternatives. And so I really want to try to use this segue then to sort of acknowledge what is available formally through what I've talked about already, international courts, but then think about people's tribunals, but then further think about how the two work together. You know, we don't want to separate them and set up this binary of, you know, international courts versus people's tribunals. We're sitting here right now at the same time as there are important cases before international courts. So we need to think really about what work we're doing through the Gaza Tribunal, but we also need to think about how we can inform the work of international courts. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you on this today. So just to underscore, I mean, firstly, I cannot stress how singularly state-based the international system is through adjudication. I mean, it is solely based, wholly based on state consent, either through states creating courts or through international organizations creating courts. And international organizations themselves are creatures of state consent. Most of the time as well, issues of accountability never even get to the international system. They are instead considered by states at the domestic level. So no matter how you look at it, there's always state power behind these formal mechanisms of accountability. And I think there are three key reasons really for why then we have a problem with civil society engagement in these fora. I mean, firstly, international adjudication is just highly fragmented in terms of its own jurisdictional coverage. For example, the ICJ only has 74 states who have signed up to its compulsory jurisdiction. It's called the optional clause, but it basically entails compulsory jurisdiction. But even for those 74 states, many of them have sort of shrunk the scope for what the court can hear about through issuing reservations to that acceptance. The Rome statute for the ICC is a bit better. It has 125 states parties, but we have to remember that even though we have this patchy jurisdictional coverage, it's really significantly eroded by the fact that the key powers internationally hardly ever choose to use these courts, to go before these courts. And furthermore, as Craig had highlighted, oftentimes these courts are actually actively undermined by the most powerful states, okay? Second, of course, as always, political considerations will inform the accountability efforts undertaken by states, both domestically and internationally. So much of the time, many really key issues just never come before courts. And I think most interesting for our purposes, though, is the fact that the law itself is a creature of state creativity. So states make the law, as we know, domestically and internationally. For international law, that is through treaty or through custom. There's almost no scope, especially directly, for civil society actors to contribute to the creation of international law. And so then we might see this as a circuitous loop, yeah? Of states making courts, adjudicating on state-made law. And within that loop, then it's very hard to penetrate and to try to think about creative accountability options for civil society actors. Nevertheless, we've had really quite amazing activity on the account of civil society in creating people's tribunals. And some people have referred to these efforts as accountability entrepreneurship, or popular protest, or some type of forums for a global conscience. And although, of course, people's tribunals, as we've also heard from Paulina and from Richard this morning, they take on many different specific institutional forms, I think we can say that generally speaking, they're all united by their sort of response to a failed interstate system. So again, we're coming back to this problem of the state, what to do with the state, to call for its end or to sort of work creatively with it. I think this is what people's tribunals really struggle with. And so I think some of them are more happy to piggyback, adopt, build on, embrace aspects of state accountability. Others want to reject it outright. But there's this very interesting dynamic, I think, between forms of state responsibility, formal state structures, and then how civil society can engage in it. I think at the very least, we might say as well that oftentimes people's tribunals try to be quite expansive in how they think about modes of responsibility, for example, by thinking more historically around forms of wrong, about bringing in a number of different types of actors who might be responsible or who might be affected by wrongs, okay? And so if we think generally about that as being the basis of many people's tribunals, then unfortunately the Palestinian people are an exemplary subject for which a people's tribunal should be constituted because of the denial for so long of Palestinian liberation and statehood, and for now in particular because of the Gaza genocide. And so we've already seen efforts on that through the Russell Tribunal on Palestine between 2009 and 2014. And so here for the rest of my talk, I just want to sort of talk about how here today in this new iteration of the People's Tribunal for Palestine, we need to think about how we can build on some of the earlier experiences of other tribunals to really shape what we're doing here today, but also I think more crucially for the future. So people's tribunals have been around almost for a century, the first being in 1933 in response to the Reichstag fire in Berlin, and this was held in London. The typical starting point, though, for people's tribunals tends to be told with the Russell Tribunal. And I think starting with the Russell Tribunal is very helpful because that then places us very much in this post-World War II UN Charter ecosystem that we've all been focusing on today. And I think really in that system, the acute problem or the acute paradox of the sort of liberation potentiality of international law coupled with its imperial dimensions, is really stark, and that was made acutely stark, if I can say that strongly, with the Vietnam War. And so that it was just such an unbelievable example through which to respond in the face of a failure, such a profound failure of accountability. And so that's when we had the establishment of the Russell Tribunal, which was basically the creation, with civil society, brought together 25 prominent intellectuals and activists from 18 states. And their role was basically to be citizen jurors. And it was firstly to provide a forum, simply to air the experiences of what was happening in Vietnam, but to go much further, to also sort of serve as a fact-finding space, but also then to actually pronounce on guilt. So the tribunal itself was asked a number of questions in relation to specific violations of international law relating, to, for example, to aggression and genocide and IHL violations. It had to make a finding in relation to these questions, and ultimately it did find the US responsible for most, not by absolute a consensus on all points, but overwhelmingly for most of these crimes. And of course, we can't pinpoint to say that the Russell Tribunal then ended up resulting in the US pulling out of Vietnam. It's something like that. But I think what's important is these very powerful persuasive statements at a moral level, is what we heard from this morning from Richard, are really, really vital then in informing later civil society efforts. The Russell Tribunal, though, I think also is important because it then precipitated later activity, including on the Permanent People's Tribunal, which we'll hear about briefly. And I wanted to talk about the text, though, that was written at sort of around this time in 1976, which is the Algiers Declaration. Now, I'll be honest, I only read the Algiers Declaration for the first time a few weeks ago. And I have to say, reading it now during Gaza's genocide was really unnerving, because the declaration begins, quote, "Every people has the right to existence." Just let me say that again. Every people has the right to existence. Such a bold and simple statement ironically underscores how many people throughout history have had their very existence threatened or eliminated. And such an opening also rejects any notion of statehood as the presumptive first right. The text builds then on existing legal norms, but it also pushes these. For example, it uses the language of both breach and violation in relation to the denial of self-determination, and then it invokes individual criminal responsibility as a worthy response. But it also stresses the importance of all forms of restitution for peoples, not states. It recognises the rights of liberation struggles to engage international organisations in various forms of political struggle, including armed struggle. And when the fundamental rights of people are under acute threat, it is the duty on the international community as a whole, and I understand the international community from the text here not as being constituted by states, but as constituted by peoples, to re-establish these norms. I think this notion then speaks to the international legal principle of peremptory norms, which enables states to take certain steps for breaches, as per what we see through the Genocide Convention. But I think potentially then it's suggesting that peoples themselves are also under a duty to take steps when there is a breach of a peremptory norm. And this, is far more radical than obviously what we would expect from something like the ICJ. This is where I think we've really got sort of creative potential through people's tribunals. One of the problems, though, for people's tribunals is that I think they straddle this irresolvable tension, as I sort of touched on before. They recognise and they respect state-based laws a lot of the time. They're not going to sort of reject the sort of corpus of international law, for example, but then they don't know the extent to which they should push them further or reject parts of them. So I think, you might see them on a spectrum of sort of quite conservative to radical. And I think depending on where we place them on that spectrum entails perhaps more challenge or less challenge to their legitimacy. And so I think two ways to counter these legitimacy questions or challenges then is obviously to think about how we can ensure that any people's tribunal is robust in the way it's thought about its own legitimacy. So particularly for the purposes of the Gaza Tribunal, I'd like to focus on two aspects of legitimacy. First is representation and second is responsibility. So firstly, when we think about a people, civil society actors are clearly saying that these people are distinct from states. It's almost like a binary has been set up by declaring a people. But this negation or binary doesn't actually provide a definition of who the people are, who's being represented. And then we have to ask, well, who's defining a people in creating such a tribunal? Were the people themselves sufficiently consulted? And does a particular tribunal then seek to sustain a dialogue with these people during the course of its institutional life? And how can diversity within a people be accommodated? And so I think to sustain its representational legitimacy, a people's tribunal needs to demonstrate really robustly how it can empower the voices of a people, even when many of them are not formally included in its processes. So this might entail regular consultation with locally based civil society actors, along with extensive space provided throughout the formal proceedings themselves for testimony, as we see here, and input. And so while the tribunal will seek to garner parts of its legitimacy from the expertise of, people like us speaking right now, that can never, ever override its core commitment to giving voice and accountability to marginalized peoples as self-determined. And secondly, if we think around legitimacy in terms of responsibility, I've sort of touched on it here, but I think what people's tribunals have really done for us thus far is to make us think far more creatively and expansively about responsibility. So this sort of making us broaden the scope, broaden the remit of what we might think about responsibility temporarily, like in terms of time, in terms of temporality, in terms of, say, geography, in terms of the actors involved, in terms of the institutions involved. But I think as well, we need to go inwards and also think about our own responsibility and our own role in terms of the People's Tribunal that is being built. So I would call then for a deep and ongoing ethical commitment on the part of members of the People's Tribunal to recognise and confront one's own complicity in structures of injustice, so that we can then, through that, push at registers of responsibility, especially to think about our own place within a vast web of both state and civil society networks. So if we look back to earlier examples of People's Tribunals, often these People's Tribunals, understandably, were really compelled to act by a sense of singularity. They had a conviction that a particular situation at a particular moment posed a unique threat to accepted understandings of law, of accountability, and of international order itself. And I suppose what I'm really intrigued by is, at this moment with Gaza, is that the case for Gaza? Or in thinking about Gaza, is this actually a challenge to the international system per se? I think I'm probably erring towards the latter point. So if that is the case, then I think the paradox of launching People's Tribunal here could not be more pronounced, because we have to ask, is the suffering of the Palestinian people the result of impunity that can be addressed through available mechanisms? Is it simply that political interests can ignore this law, or more fundamentally, is the law itself implicated in these harms? And then what is our relationship to that law? How transformational do we want the law that we're trying to reimagine be through the tribunal? So I think that a People's Tribunal for Gaza will obviously serve as a critique of the law, but I think it can also be a space for reimagining international law. And I think the best way to do that is to follow in the steps of earlier People's Tribunals, particularly with their focus on creating a sort of fact-based archive. Okay, and we're already seeing this in terms of the witness statements and all of the evidence being produced from the tribunal. And as Zamet Borda and Mandelbaum point out, once states have this account that is presented to them by People's Tribunals, they have three choices. They ignore it, they deny it, or they can change their policies. But I think the archive itself, as presented by a People's Tribunal, is extremely valuable, again, as sort of touching back on what Phyllis was saying, as a way to help sort of push other efforts in the future. I'm just going to try to skip some of my talk because I'm conscious that I don't want to sort of take up too much time. I mean, I do think we can be quite creative in the way we think
Michelle.
about notions of law as well that I'll talk about it later. So I think then in terms of what we might think of as this tribunal's legacy, I think, is it going to be providing a factual account? Is it going to be providing a moral judgment? Do we see it as being a classroom of global civic responsibility through a politics of listening? Is it a space for reimagining the law? Is it a space for witness testimony? Or is it sort of contributing to being the building block of a Palestinian state? I think it's probably all of those things. I think it will also be more than those things, because ultimately it's about how future civil society activists themselves want to use what is produced through the tribunal, and we can't preempt that. I think what's really crucial, though, is the role that the archives themselves can play, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow. And that I think as well, we always need to be cognizant of this ongoing conversation, this dialogue that is actually taking place right now between tribunals like this one and formal international courts or domestic courts, as, for example, the ICJ and the ICC. Thank you very much.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. And now we are very privileged to have with us two representatives from the Permanent People's Tribunal. First, beaming in from Cambodia is Helen Jarvis. Helen is the Deputy Secretary General of the Permanent People's Tribunal, and she'll be followed by Gianni Tognoni, who is the Secretary General of the Permanent People's Tribunal. Gianni and Helen have been involved in a great many People's Tribunals, so it's a privilege to learn from them today. Thank you. Over to you, Helen. Welcome, and I'm sorry for the difficulties with zooming in.
Thank you, Penny. Can you hear me? Because it has been difficult. Hello? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, you can. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, it's been tricky getting in from Cambodia, I'm afraid. What I wanted to do was to talk about, as the indeed Vice President of the Permanent People's Tribunal, to talk to this august meeting of minds on the situation in Gaza and the Gaza Tribunal. What is interesting to me is that we are appropriately juxtapositioned here between two different panels. One is deficiencies of the formal international normative order, and the other is activism of civil society and social movements. And we have had fantastic presentations, I think, today on both of those aspects, and it's right within the juncture of these two concepts and activities that the People's Tribunal, Permanent People's Tribunal, in fact all People's Tribunals, and including the Gaza Tribunal stand, fully aware of the failures, and as we've heard today, not necessarily accidental failures, but perhaps designed indeed to fail, and of international law and international legal institutions, which to us are not surprising at all. But yet today they're becoming more and more blatant with regard to Gaza. And I think just in the last week, the number of governments, not only governments, but also newspapers, television programs, important influencers around the world have finally come to see that indeed the emperor has no clothes, and we have a case of blatant imperialism and aggression. In the discussion yesterday, the importance of correctly naming crimes against humanity, including genocide and apartheid, while they are being committed, was raised. And I think this is something that has been quite a key objective of the PPT from its early days, well, from the Russell Tribunal days on Vietnam. It's actually intervening at the time something is taking place and naming names. But of course, naming isn't enough in and of itself. We have to recall, of course, that the first objective of the Genocide Convention is prevention. But as Gregory Stanton says, by the time the ICJ gets around to ruling, if the crime is not prevented, then the genocide could have been achieved and everybody would be dead or forcibly displaced. So we have to always remember that naming is only one half of the operation, but actually acting and preventing, stopping something is what's needed. If and when Gaza is sentenced by an international court, it would be a significant moment indeed, and one that is tremendously and culpably overdue, and one that, as we've heard today, under the present system, seems to not have the possibility of enforcement. Stands as a symbolic gesture until, indeed, civil society perhaps can rise, social movements can rise and force a change, as we heard so movingly presented, I think, by Phyllis earlier in the session, last session, with regard to the anti-apartheid movement. An international society that can tolerate being a spectator of such crimes is already responsible for everything that has happened. I wanted to just speak very briefly about the Permanent People's Tribunal. Michelle's already spoken quite a lot about it. So just to remind people that indeed it grew out of the Russell Tribunals on Vietnam in 66, 67, which, as she said, perhaps certainly in and of itself cannot claim having brought an end to the war and forcing the US to withdraw, but it certainly was appreciated and was noted as part of a worldwide movement of peoples. And only 2 weeks ago, I was in Ho Chi Minh City for the 50th anniversary of the end of the war and reunification of Vietnam, and the attention and support, appreciation that was given to the international community who stood by in solidarity with Vietnam was very much highlighted. But so after the Russell Tribunals in the 70s, we had also tribunals on the dictatorships in Latin America. Again, as Michelle says, documenting, huge amount of documentation, but also naming and calling for action. And then in 1976, the Universal Declaration of People's Rights in Algiers, which Michelle has referred to today too. And then after that, 1979, the Permanent People's Tribunal was formally established as a permanent institution devoted to listening to peoples forced to deal with the absence of law and impunity. The tribunal has reached judgments on 54 sessions over this period, a wide range of cases of violation, including violations of human and people's rights, taking up in particular the rights to self-determination for people such as the Elam Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Rohingya people, and the Kurds. We are pleased to stand today with you in solidarity with the people of Palestine. In this Gaza Tribunal, we need to focus on the long-standing unconditional right of colonized people to self-determination. And if I may say so, I think a little more attention might be given to that. I don't know if the rest of the tribunal is going to deal with that in more length. But I think we talked about Nakba, but we didn't really focus on the structural relationship of colonialism and what has happened in regard to Palestine. I think the right of Palestinians to independence, establishment of a state, and the right of return are absolutely unconditional. These rights cannot be denied or refuted. In international law, they're absolute. they cannot be negated by Israel's spurious argument that its Gazan annihilation is in self-defense. The intent to establish and maintain Israel as an apartheid state, so clearly outlined in Chamber 1 by Victor Katan, and then today by Lara Elborno, when she drew out the essential displacement and destruction of the Palestinian population as a necessary and essential condition for the achievement of the settler colonial enterprise from way back at the time of its inception in the 19th century. Israel's continuous moves to achieve that end have been well documented, implemented in repeated episodes of repression, land seizures, and siege, and now are even more clearly, explicitly, and unashamedly articulated as intent. Not only could the evidence of the crimes committed be more visible, as has been testified over 2 days by eyewitnesses and victims in harrowing detail, but what is still happening in Gaza reveals ever more clearly that criminal responsibility is not only that of Israel, but includes and is indeed enabled by the explicit and decisive connivance and participation of the United States and its all too many Western allies, and the silence or impotence of the organs and institutions of the United Nations. And I was particularly interested in the idea that Craig Mokhiber came up with of the 2 United Nations, which we're all too aware of here in Cambodia. Gaza has become the exemplary documentation of a comprehensive and profound picture of an international society emptied of its capacity to recognize, defend, and promote the fundamental right to life of really actually existing peoples who are being transformed into objects, victims, collateral damage, design damage, or even human animals. The Palestinian people today are the most visible expression and the summarizing symbol of all those people, humans around the world who enter, remain, and die in the gaps in international law of states. The tragically real and symbolic people of Gaza declare the urgent need for concrete investment of resources to think, to create, to experiment an international law which could be credible as an instrument for the future and its emerging challenges and needs. As a tribune of visibility and voice of the many Palestinian peoples in this world, this Gaza Tribunal and other solidarity actions by popular social movements can and absolutely must devote themselves to achieving this necessary condition for human survival. The case of Palestine and the egregious incapacity of the established international legal system to do anything to stop the violations oblige us to look more broadly, facing the truth about what was the objective of the so-called rules-based order that is being shredded before our eyes. We should be setting our objectives not on reforming, tinkering here and there, but to go back, indeed, as I will, to conclude my remarks, as Michelle went back earlier, to the Universal Declaration of People's Rights, issued in Algiers in 1976, but also true today. We live at a time of great hopes and deep despair, a time of conflicts and contradictions, a time when liberation struggle have succeeded in arousing the peoples of the world against the domestic and international structures of imperialism and in overturning colonial systems, a time of struggle and victory in which new ideals of justice among and within nations have been adopted, at a time when the General Assembly has given increasing expression from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the Charter on Economic and Social Rights and Duties of States to the quest for a new international political and economic order. But the declaration goes on to say, this is also a time of frustration and defeat, as new forms of imperialism evolve to oppress and exploit the peoples of the world. Imperialism using vicious methods with the complicity of governments that it has itself often installed through multinational enterprises, through manipulation of corrupt local politicians, with the assistance of military regimes based on police repression, torture, and physical extermination of opponents, through a set of practices that has become known in those days as neocolonialism. Imperialism extends its stranglehold today over many peoples. And that's where I'll end my remarks and hand it over to our Secretary General, Gianni Tognoni.
Very good.
Thanks to Ellen. My role as I am here just to represent really the big interest and participation of the People's Tribunal to this important initiative of the Gaza Tribunal. I have simply the role of making some wishes and recommendation, if but possibly be, to the District Tribunal based not on my impression or idea, but because of the experience which I had with the 50 cases of people who were facing with different severity the same questions of the Palestinian people. To be real suffering victims of repression and to be clearly the object of denial of right by the international community. My best, most important wish would be that the tribunal in Gaza will be specifically looking for the future of the Palestinian people, because the evidence of what has been the suffering of the Palestinian people is so beyond any reasonable doubt, which cannot be considered to be a juridical problem. I think that will be a great example to make a decision starting from here for the declaration that the principal problem is not the debate, while we have heard very, very good presentation on genocide, competence of the court. That's really marginal from the point of view of the real right of people. We have to stop now the violations, because while the international law could be without time, the real people do not have the time to die and die and die because they are victims, and there are delays in the juridical qualification of the responsibility of their life. So I think that will be very important to be aware of this right, which is not tolerating even more delays because of uncertainty on law. When the law is uncertain, the rights should be respected, not the opposite. And I think that is very important, because otherwise the debates will go on and on and on, and will impede also any effort of reparation, which is what has been said, one of the main points, and Craig has been very important, for the prevention of the process of genocide, which is ongoing, but which is apparently without any limit, because we cannot even now qualify what is happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza, because it's simply with horror. The second point, I close rapidly. I will be able to participate more. I think it will be what Elaine was mentioning. Let's give true names to those who are the spectator, allies. They are protagonists. The USA are protagonists of the genocide. They are not connivant of genocide. If they stop, the genocide will stop. Europe is not a connivant of that, or Germany or something like that. They cannot imagine to be ignorant. They are responsible directly. And that could be important, because if we have to imagine, as Surani was saying yesterday, that Gaza should not be the last graveyard of international law, we have to look for a new international law capable of respecting people who are now existing, not simply which are belonging to history. I think that is what is requested, and that is the experience of the People's Tribunal, to have judgment which are on real time, when they are living, where they are looking for the future. And I think that is the major right of the Palestinian people, to have a future now. Too many children, women, we have heard about the reproductive genocide. Everything has been said, is too late already now. And I do hope that since the declaration here of Sarajevo, and even more now for the verdict, will be something which make really pressure. We have heard that, in fact, one of the model cases which have been commented today, the apartheid, the victory against apartheid has been the victims of Mandela, of the freedom factor, like Swarani was saying, or the pressure of the population. No juridical clarification now is what is needed for the Palestinian. Then the historians of the international law will discuss whether, in fact, all the definition of genocide were fitting, but that is marginal with respect to the present rights of this population. Thanks.
Well, that was marvelous. Thank you. And I'm very happy to say that we've basically caught up. So you've got 5 minutes to have a little break, and then we'll return for the final panel of today's Chamber 2 sessions. What I will say is there are people I'm sure have many questions, but we'll save all the questions for the end of the final panel, and Craig will introduce that final question series, and I will moderate it. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Toilet break, basically.